Today we're going to talk about the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. This is a book I really do think everybody should read it. It's in the Great Book Set. Why is it in the Great Book Set? Because I think that this book, more than almost anything else that you could read, is going to show you the power of ideas to have impact in society. Because the 20th century is really fresh for us in today's world, and there's a lot of memories about certain government leaders like Mao and Stalin and others who took either all of this whole and tried to implement it as really an ideology, or took bits and pieces of it and tried to implement it where they were. Even in the Middle East and other places in the world, these ideas have had great impact and really affected millions and millions and millions of lives. And, you know, through the hands of really evil men, really, I don't know if we should, sadistic men maybe, tyrants certainly, these ideas took the lives of millions. So it's really, really important, because when you read it, then you say, oh, well, that's really bad, and that doesn't seem like such a big deal, and yet the fundamental principles and concepts upon which Marx's ideas lie have changed the world forever. And so it's really a testimony to the truth that ideas really rule the world, that when a great thinker puts forward a new idea, it can change the way that millions of people act and behave when it has great influence, when it's really taken up and loved and read and all that kind of stuff. And the truth is that so often it's through the universities and through the educational tracks, through the education of a nation or a group of people, that an idea is promoted. In Mao's day, he took some of the concepts from Communist Manifesto. He kind of added his own twist and his own rules and everything. And it was the little red book? Was it the little red book, or I think? And everybody carried it around in their pocket, and they were supposed to memorize basically the whole thing, memorize large sections of it, and it really had a lot of influence. Now there's another thing in this introduction. Mine is published by Crofts Classics, and I'm really grateful. I just grabbed it because it was a cheap paperback, but I'm really grateful I have this one, because Samuel Beard did the introduction, and he says a few things. This introduction is so good, and I think everybody should read this introduction, because he does a great job of explaining why this is such an important work and how it's had so much influence. But he says a couple things here near the beginning that I want to read to you for a second, because it's really going to help you understand why communism had such a big influence, because it had such an emotional appeal. And here's why. Here's what Samuel Beer says. Marxism is especially like religion in the nature of certain basic questions which it attempts to answer. It includes, though not under these names, a theory of how evil came into the world and how it will be eliminated, a vision of powers which are beyond man's control and inflict suffering upon him, which carry him onward to a blessed fulfillment, a prophecy of a final paradise where humanity will live in perfect freedom and happiness. It is impossible to understand the deep appeal of the Marxist system unless we consider its powerful effect upon emotions which are essentially religious. This is why, when you start reading about worldviews, which is why Worldviews has its own subheading on this blog, why worldviews I think is so important for people to study, is because they show us the way other people think, and they help us to relate to people of all backgrounds and to see the unity of humankind, but also the differences. And that is critical to effective communication and to leadership of all kinds in the home and outside the home. And so what he's saying is that Marxism, communism, is really basically a religion. And if you look closely at the places where it's really been largely implemented over a large group of people or in a culture, religion has been taken out. Traditional religion, worship of God, the God or whatever, has been taken out of that society and has become illegal or whatever, because this is an appeal to those same religious devotions, and it can't survive side by side with worship of a god. Because in a very real sense, the leader of the Communist Party becomes the god. If you look at pictures of Russia and China, and you'll see, I mean, I don't even know how large they are. They're much, much larger than life-size billboards all over throughout the cities of the current leader, because he is the one that you're meant to worship. In The Red Scarf Girl, which we have posted here, there's a segment where one of the young girls comes back from a communist rally, and she's kind of a youth leader. And the Red Scarf Girl, the woman that wrote the book, when she was a girl, she went to hear this girl speak, and this girl just wept when she was talking about Mao, in the same way that you would expect someone to weep and to be very, very spiritually moved by a religious experience. So that is why it is such so powerful, and it also speaks to the fact, Tocqueville talked about this, others have talked about the idea that religion has the greatest power to move people to action, that we do things more because of our core belief systems than anything else. And when you can unite a group of people, that's why there's stories of people who have done, mass suicides together based on religious ideas, because worship is such a core part of who we are as human beings. It's something we need and want. Anyway, so that really helps explain why communism had such a huge hold in the 20th century. It was appealing to religious emotions, and it's a new approach to history. Marx wanted to re-explain history from a whole new vantage point, which nobody had ever thought of before. That's also why it's one of the great books, and it's a brand new idea, because he said history is the history of class struggles, that essentially history is about economics, and tied it to economic problems, which are human problems, because people have always struggled with pride and divided themselves into groups, and there's always been rich and poor, that kind of idea. But he essentially is appealing to the underclass, to the proletariat, to rise up and take over, and there would be a new classless society where the world would then experience utopia or millennia or whatever your religious ideas might call it. So he goes on, Samuel Beer goes on the next page to talk about something else which I think is really important to the discussion of why read the Communist Manifesto. He says, often within the exaggeration of Marxist doctrine, a kernel of truth may be found. The Marxist system of thought is particularly useful, however, because it raises questions which force the reader to state his own beliefs or doubts on important subjects. There again, now, for youth, Communist Manifesto should be well mentored, and it should be done in a way that helps the student to identify truth and falsehood, and to filter things back to principle, and to not be deceived, right? He says, within the exaggeration of Marxist doctrine, he recognizes that communism is an exaggeration of a few ideas, that it's an ideology rather than a worldview, in the sense that it takes a couple of core truths or ideas and tries to make them answer all of life's questions, and that's not whole, as a healthier worldview will be. A real worldview will be healthy enough in multiple areas that it will bring you closer to truth and help you become a healthier, more whole person. And when we talk about some other worldviews books, that will probably make more sense to you. But as an approach toward understanding the communist worldview of the 20th century, this is a core book that needs to be read and studied and understood. And as you read through it, it will force you to say, well, I don't agree that that's how evil came into the world. I don't agree that that's how women should be handled. I don't agree that that's what the family is, or that the family isn't important. I don't agree that economics should be managed in that way. Well, why? That's what Samuel Beer is saying is the value of it. As soon as you start to disagree with Marx, you've got to decide why you disagree, how you disagree. You've got to start arguing with him. And you can't just throw out platitudes that you've been taught. You've got to start to have real solid arguments based on something solid, and then the real thinking begins, which is marvelous. So it's not real long. He goes through and talks about a handful of ideas. The bourgeoisie, I think, or the bourgeois, I think is how you say it. That's a French word. That means the elite. And so it's a power struggle, a class struggle between those two groups, and he's appealing to the proletariat to rise up. And those are his last words. He says, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. So that's how it ends. And you can go through the mental work of figuring out how he expects them to do that and how he gets to that place. One other thing I want to point out, there's 3 sections. That's at the end of a section of 3 called Socialist and Communist Literature. Communist is the means to get to socialism. It is a socialist approach. It is in the socialist camp that everyone will own everything unitedly together, but the party will facilitate that happening, and it will come from the poor, and so the poor will be more fair, and all of those kinds of ideas. But at the end of section 2, he has a list, and this is a very important list because in the middle of this, first he lays out his ideas and his historical concepts, and then he says, okay, well, here's how we're going to bring communism into being. And it's amazing. Here's another thing that's so amazing is that it had so much impact and it's so short. You could really sit down and read it in a couple hours and have a pretty good understanding of it. It's something you should reread. You should read it more than once, understand it, and you should definitely talk to someone about it, preferably a group. And you should compare it to other whole works that talk about more whole and true historical and economic and governmental principles. But, so he says, okay, so we want to bring communism about. How are we going to do that? Well, if you have, there's certain governmental forms, right? There's certain governmental types. So if you have a monarchy, then this is how we're going to go about it. We're just going to overthrow the monarchy, which of course it was most easiest to implement in those ancient monarchical empirical traditions in Russia and China, and it took hold for the strongest hold and the longest in those countries. Well, then he says, okay, so what do you do in a democracy? What do you do in other places like England, kind of Canada, US, other places where everyone is seen as equal and there's this totally over the form in place where people vote and you have republicanism, all that kind of stuff. He says, these measures will of course be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. And then he gives 10 points. Look those over. You're going to notice that essentially all 10 of them in some form have already been put in place and are being continually progressed toward. Now, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think there's one group that controls everything and does everything. But I do think that ideas move the world, and I do think that when you have concentrated ideas in a place where people can access them, especially through books, and you get leadership together that believes in that they can move forward ideas. So this is a very important reading. I think everyone should read it at younger ages. It should be well mentored for your youth. But get it and read it and start to understand the worldviews that had the greatest impact on the 20th century, and I think you'll be surprised what you find. See you next time.